All right, so getting into create policy, now that we have all that context and some additional resources to go reference for more detail, we need to start thinking about what our deaccession policy will look like. So in terms of content, we need to make sure we reference our collecting mission. If you have not created your collecting mission yet, or you feel like you need to update it, go and do that first. And there's a whole other webinar if you need it on that. Second, you need to reference an agreement that exists between donor and organization. Even if you didn't have one before, you should have one now. Yeah, you should you should have one now, and you should reference it in your deaccession policy. Even if you within your organization, it's like in draft mode or what have you, it's very important to make sure you have those pieces and that they're referencing each other, because that's how a policy can exist and function, is with these other features. And then create criteria for deaccessioning. So we've talked about a couple different things as we've moved along in terms of what would make an item eligible for considering to deaccession. There are many different criteria to consider, some of which will depend on your type of organization, the type of collection you have, the history of collecting at your institution, how sort of wild or not it was. So there may be different criteria for your museum or archives, separate from a peer museum or archives. Then outline scenarios for when items may be considered for deaccession. So as deaccessioning can be a normal part of our collection stewardship, I would recommend you mentioning in your policy and actually doing periodic review of your collection with the intent to deaccession items that if they hit that criteria, then deaccession them. That way it's not this overwhelming thing that builds up over time. It's perhaps more of an annual or every other year, or pick a thing that makes sense for you in terms of the amount of stuff that comes in, how much space restriction you have, stuff like that. In addition to, there may be other scenarios like, if we move storage facilities, if we have an abrupt decrease in staff, things like that would trigger a major, we have to look at everything now to possibly deaccession. I also recommend stipulating how items will be deaccessioned. So having a specific section on disposal methods, of which we'll still cover in a bit more detail in just a moment, and identifying criteria for those disposal methods. So what would be more in line and appropriate to sell versus what may be more appropriate to give back to like community of origin, or what may be more appropriate to destroy because the content itself is harmful, whether in terms of like the content or the actual material. Criteria for deaccessioning. So this is the typical stuff that pretty much everybody should have in there, in addition to your like special case to you kind of criteria. First of all, doesn't fit or no longer fits in your collecting mission, is a lesser version of similar items, is a duplicate of original materials, and especially looking at you archives with photocopies, etc. And similarly is a non-original material. For both archives and museums, the type of collection items you should be acquiring for the most part should be original. Another item in here is damage beyond repair. So it could be an original item, it could be something that fits the collecting mission, but if it's covered in mold or it's just like beyond recognition because it's so broken, for many reasons, it may be time to get rid of it. So for those two bullet points, it could be damage beyond repair, or it is itself so damaged and yet also so hazardous that it's a risk to the other collections. And finally, is an outsized portion of a collection, as in there are too many similar items in your collection for that one thing, that it's not allowing you to collect in any other depth or breadth in other areas of your collection. And the concept found in collection. So this has sort of popped up in a couple of our other webinars leading to deaccessioning today, and that is the concept of items being found in your collection. as in these items made their way to somehow your museum or archives. There's no paperwork, or at least no paperwork that includes like a donor name or any sort of donor agreement. There may be some institutional memory in terms of like, yeah, we've had that since like 1980. Or like, I think maybe the Johnson family gave that to us. So you may have some like rumors in terms of provenance, but essentially it's just something that is found there. You're not sure how it got there. Not a lot of detail. So that is the concept of an item being found in collection, and there's some implications to this. For policy examples, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, the Spurlock Museum of World Cultures. Go check out their policy. It is pretty thorough, and it does a great job of referencing, in this case, the state of Illinois' abandoned property law. So you'll get a sense of how to reference, applicable state law and then build policy on that foundation, specifically for undocumented property or otherwise found in collection kind of stuff. Archives-wise, the Society of American Archivists have a reappraisal and deaccessioning document. It's from 2017, so it's like a smidge old. However, much of the content still stands. Very similar to museums in terms of what that policy is going to look like, but I recommend you go check out these particular guidelines. Again, not behind a paywall, so you should be able to access these just fine. And then I wanted to highlight, this isn't necessarily a publication of policy, but the USC Pacific Asia Museum has done an excellent job with like the notice part of it, or the outreach education part facing externally of, hey, we've got some abandoned property. We are issuing a termination notice for undocumented objects. Here's the process we went through. Here's who is responsible for it. Here's the stipulation we have in terms of, you have 3 years to claim, etc. And then they've posted it in the newspaper as well. And there's a series of newspaper posts that they did, most likely in fulfillment of part of that state law, in this case, California. So I thought that was an excellent execution of, you have policy, you have state law to reference, you are going through the act of deaccessioning, and in recognition of your responsibility for maintaining public trust, you are announcing and being transparent about the process of deaccessioning that you are going through, and you're doing it in making good faith effort to let your stakeholders and community know what is happening and when it's happening. So policy elements when there are items found in collection, because your deaccession policy should be intended to cover items that came into your collection officially and with paperwork, and also items that are found in collection. So first and foremost, the best policies out there are the ones that identify who's responsible for the research portion and then the determination or decision portion. Sometimes that is the same person if you're a super small shop. Sometimes it's different. I recommend using job titles versus people's names. That way the documentation stays evergreen versus like every time staff turnover happens, you have to update. Also, gather all information pertaining to that item, including any sort of institutional memory, how long the items have been in institutional care. So having the policy account for instructions on what sort of information to gather, what information is helpful, that kind of thing. And then using that, having the policy dictate the type of report or known facts reporting, with the recommendation of either needing to hold on to it for a few more years to meet state law requirements, or yes, we've had it forever. It's documented through institutional memory, so we can definitely, we've met state rules, we can deaccession. Speaking of which, reference the state law and any other related policies, especially if you're like an archives or museum unit underneath a larger organization. And then outline if there's a minimum custody period before deaccession can occur. So as you're putting together that report, the deaccession policy should stipulate that as part of that summary and decision, stating specifically if there's a minimum custody year that still needs to be met. And then finally, capturing if there's a notice requirement that needs to happen. So for example, the USC notice that we were just looking at, if they are doing that in order to meet part of California state law, and if that's part of your requirements under your state law, that should also be part of your deaccession policy, is this element of providing communication to the public in terms of what's happening, what specifically is considered for deaccession, and when.